From murderers to perjurers, Donald Trump is giving some a second chance. As the president enters his final days in office, he's issuing a swathe of pardons. But is he abusing his power by misusing his privilege? Amalia Hassan and today's Newsmakers are Donald Trump's controversial acts of clemency. In September 2007, more than a dozen Iraqi civilians were shot and killed. The perpetrators, security guards from the controversial private military firm Blackwater. For years, the victims' families fought for justice and eventually prevailed when 4 American contractors were found guilty of manslaughter. But instead of languishing behind bars, the once convicted war criminals are walking free after being pardoned by the US president. And they're not the only ones to get a helping hand from the commander-in-chief. Trump loyalists linked to his impeachment, like Roger Stone and Paul Manfort, have also been granted clemency. So, what exactly is the president basing his pardons on, and are they justified? We'll discuss that in a moment. But first, Adam Platz has this report.
As President Trump continues to deny his electoral defeat, he's been spending the dying days of his presidency handing out pardons to convicted criminals. The most controversial are to 4 contractors of the private security company formerly known as Blackwater. The men were convicted in US courts of killing 17 innocent Iraqi civilians in 2007, including women and children. In Iraq, the presidential exonerations have reopened old wounds.
First of all, it's a notorious company, and the decision that Trump issued in regards to this company is an injustice against all Iraqis. Its presence was not to protect Iraqis, but to kill them.
The UN says the Blackwater Pardons violate international law and undermine human rights at a global level. And the senior US diplomatic and military leaders in Iraq at the time have condemned what they see as Trump's ill-considered clemency.
The pardon of these individuals can only be seen as hugely damaging, an action that tells the world that Americans abroad can commit the most heinous crimes with impunity. It places our military and civilian personnel at increased risk, and it betrays our most fundamental values. American prestige, credibility, and security have all been seriously undermined.
Charges against the Blackwater 4 were originally dismissed in 2009, leading President-elect Joe Biden, then Obama's vice president, to assure Iraqis that a fair trial would be held.
Today, I'm announcing that the United States government will appeal this decision. Our Justice Department will file that appeal.
Biden will not be able to reverse Trump's decision, as presidential pardons cannot be revoked. But some legal experts say that if Trump's exonerations have been used as bribes or favors, then he should be prosecuted. Blackwater was founded by Eric Prince, who was also allegedly involved in back-channel talks with Russia on behalf of the Trump administration. Overall, Trump has made fewer pardons than previous presidents, but has mostly bypassed the Justice Department's usual review process. Analysis in the Lawfare blog by Jack Goldsmith, a Harvard law professor, indicates that almost 90% of Trump's pardons had a personal or political connection to the president. Perhaps Trump's least contentious pardon was that of corn, the Thanksgiving turkey.
Corn, I hereby grant you a full pardon. Thank you, Corn. What a great.
But even that provoked questioning.
Office, will you be issuing a pardon for yourself?
In 1974, President Nixon's Justice Department decided that granting oneself a pardon wouldn't be possible. But Trump has been known to break presidential norms before. At any rate, more pardons are expected before he leaves office. Adam Platz, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's cross over now to lawyer and retired Army Colonel Kurt Schlichter in Los Angeles. He's the author of The 21 Biggest Lies About Donald Trump and You. Jelena Aparaj is in Zagreb, Croatia. She's the chair of the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries. And in Lancaster in the UK is Robert Gucci Jr. He's an expert in US politics and a senior lecturer at Lancaster University. Kurt, Donald Trump has been issuing some controversial pardons in the last days of his presidency. Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and Jared Kushner's father, Charles Kushner. But perhaps the most surprising one, if you will, from a negative point of view, is the pardon of 4 Americans convicted of killing 14 unarmed Iraqi civilians in Baghdad while working as Blackwater contractors in 2007. How do you explain this particular pardon?
Well, thanks for having me. Look, Donald Trump clearly saw that there were problems with this prosecution, that there's an ambiguity in any kind of combat situation. The idea that a bunch of contractors, most of them ex-military who were trained and know how to operate in a hostile area, would go out and purposely murder a bunch of Iraqis for no good reason is absolutely ridiculous. The idea that they would, that a United States District Court in the United States would come and charge these guys with an alleged crime that happened overseas, where you have an insurgency going on, where you can't rely on the witnesses, where you can't rely on the government, where you can't rely on anyone to give you an honest or complete story, and you can't place yourself in the situation of those men. I think it was that he saw, after consulting with the Department of Justice, because that's what he had to do, and the military, he saw that this was a miscarriage of justice, and he acted to correct it.
So are you saying, Kurt, that these 4 Americans convicted of the killing of 14 unarmed Iraqi civilians are innocent?
I'm saying that we can't know to the degree that we need to. Now, look, it's not hard to get a conviction in a federal court. You get about 95% of the time you're going to get convicted. And the federal government, though it's been trying to undo it, has a very powerful reputation. If it charges someone, they're very likely to be convicted. However, really, how are these guys going to defend themselves effectively? How are these guys going to be able to go back in time and show a jury exactly what happened? It's a combat situation. It's an insurgency. There are people shooting at them. How are they supposed to go and gather the evidence that they need to demonstrate that this isn't exactly what happened?
So
I think that Donald Trump saw that ambiguity, and that's probably why Donald Trump acted.
Well, the one international institution that did not recognize and see any ambiguity, Kurt, is the UN. They say this pardon is a violation of international law.
You know, the UN, which I have worked with overseas, is not the United States government, and we don't answer to the UN. It's a voluntary association. I'm absolutely unconcerned with what the UN thinks in any context, as is the president, as is most Americans.
Jelena, you heard what Kurt had to say. You think this pardon is justified. Your reply?
Yes, well, the national courts, they brought the judgment, so there is also the justice system that we have to believe in the very democratic system such as US. But does the pardon violate international law? That is the real question, and it's actually composed of 2 sub-questions. Does international law applies in this context? Given that the US is a sovereign state, which means they're also independent vis-a-vis other states, and as such, they can exercise state functions. But one of the state functions that United States exercise is also ratification of international treaties and international instruments. And the United States, by exercising their sovereignty, ratified Geneva Conventions as early as 1955, and many, many very important conventions related to means and methods of warfare. Once they ratify those conventions, they have the obligation to implement them in their domestic system, which means they have to comply with those international obligations. So concretely, this means that once they engage in international obligations, they cannot use any domestic legislation, even the Constitution, as an excuse to violate international law. Now, why is the international law important in this context? well, international humanitarian law and human rights law make obligations for states, which are three fundamental obligations. That is to say, to investigate war crimes, to search for war criminals, and to prosecute them. And pardoning them is actually part of the breach of the obligation of prosecuting them. And basically, this element, this pardon, can create internationally wrongful act in international law for the United States, and therefore United States as a state can be responsible for that. But also as a chief commander of the US Army, by pardoning them under this command responsibility doctrine, and some have been saying that pardon itself could constitute a war crime. So it's not as simple as Kurt was saying.
Kurt, I want to give you a chance to respond. Yelena is very clear that this case does fall under international law, does constitute a violation of international law. I saw you shake your head there while she was speaking.
Well, I'm both a retired colonel and an American lawyer. With respect, you're wrong about everything, probably including your punctuation. The Constitution of the United States is supreme over the United Nations or any treaty. It is, we do not answer as Americans to foreigners. The United Nations has zero influence and zero power. Our Constitution reigns supreme. A pardon is part of the American judicial system. It is a part and parcel of it. It is not something outside it. And to exercise it cannot be a war crime. Now, no one is saying that they support war crimes. If these people went out and purposely murdered 14 innocent people, that is a crime. I'm not sure because they're not, I'm not sure of their combatant status, but whether it's a war crime or just murder, it would be a legal question. However, the issue isn't whether murder is wrong. I think we're all agreed on that. And I think we're all agreed that people should be punished if they commit murder in a war zone. I strongly support that. And I strongly support prosecution for war crimes. And when I served in the Balkans, that was one of our important issues there, to help to redress war crimes that had occurred before we got there. However, let's be really clear. What this is about whether these people actually did what they're accused of. And the idea that it's a war crime for the president to exercise his right under the Constitution to pardon convicted people is, well, it's kind of crazy. And
but Kurt,
why
Kurt, if I may interrupt you,
that's kind of why.
If I may interrupt you just for a second, even the very prominent and esteemed U.S. General David Petraeus himself, who led U.S. forces in Iraq, calls this a mistake, calls this pardon a mistake and wrong.
I wonder if he'd take a pardon himself, since he was convicted of a crime himself. But, you know, whether it was a mistake in the sense of politically, or whether they really were guilty, that's an issue that can be debated. What can't be debated is the president's power to do it. And what can't be debated is the fact that there were significant problems with this prosecution in terms of allowing the defendants the chance to reasonably defend themselves. How can you gather, how can people locked up in the United States gather the kind of evidence they need across the world in a war zone where people have political agendas that support them being prosecuted?
Right. Robert,
I think the president signed the act, and it's not a war crime.
Robert, you listened to both Kurt and Yelena's arguments. What do you make of this pardon?
Well, I think what's really interesting about this conversation and what it's showing is that we're actually not talking about the specifics of this case, of this pardon, and how easily this conversation turns into an ideological, nightmarish battle that is so much entrenched in American disdain for the international community. And you know, our guests will make the argument that the U.S. has a right too want to be outside of an international global community where we have agreed upon standards of living and rules by which we conduct ourselves as civilized societies. That's certainly sovereign nations' right to discard those things. But I think what this conversation is showing to me is the great amount of discomfort that Americans, a good swath of Americans, have with anything outside of its borders. This isn't about this conversation. Sure as hell isn't about the specifics of if these people did right or wrong. It's immediately turned into if America's good or bad, and if the UN is good or bad, and that America should be great and take itself and everybody else can go somewhere else. And I think that is this state of politics and ideology in the United States that we're going to have to deal with going forward. But we haven't even talked once about the specifics of who these people are and what they're doing. And I think that speaks to the amount of aggression, uncomfortable aggression in the United States for anything. The word foreigner was used, which is quite shocking, in fact, in terms of its racialized implications that word is being used. And so I think that this conversation for me is more about the state of disorder in the United States and how it sees itself in a global world after the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, what we do know about this particular case is, of course, that 4 Americans were accused and ultimately convicted of killing 14 unarmed Iraqi civilians in Baghdad, Iraq, while working as Blackwater contractors in 2007. That is completely undisputed. And as you say, Robert, perhaps the aspect most disturbing. Interestingly enough, Yelena, some people have argued that the pardon sends a very damaging message to the rest of the world, namely that Americans abroad can commit any sort of crimes and kill with impunity. Would you concur? Is that the message?
Yes, unfortunately, this is a very strong message that's being sent. It undermines the image of United States and the international relations, international scene, but also it undermines international humanitarian law and human rights law. And it does say, well, we American military, and not just military, but private military contractors working for United States can operate in total impunity. Prosecuting private military contractors is extremely difficult. They are blurring the differences between military officials and unofficial military personnel in the battlefield. They are blurring the differences between what is a military person and a civilian person in a battlefield. So actually pinpointing at them in the situations like Nisour massacre and actually conducting the investigations. Just to say, the FBI investigation in the Nisour massacre was one of the most challenging and most expensive ones, if I'm informed correctly, is extremely challenging. And therefore, when we do have a decision and we do have a court decision on their criminal conduct, then we have to support that decision. We have to believe in the justice system, especially in the state like US. And it is actually one of the rare cases of the prosecution of the private military companies. So the message is really, really concerning and worrying.
Yeah, Kurt, interestingly enough, according to the US Department of Justice, Donald Trump has actually granted clemency less frequently than any president in modern history. So he's obviously very careful and selective as to whom to pardon. Now, therefore, this pardon of the Blackwater contractors, is it an extension of his America First mantra that he has laid out even as a candidate?
I don't think it's a part of the American First notion, but I want to be really clear about something. I'm an American. I've spent years of my life, along with millions of other Americans, cleaning up foreigners' messes. I did in the Balkans, I did behind what was the Iron Curtain, I did in the Middle East, and so did a whole bunch of us. So I don't need to be lectured about the United States. We've contributed more treasure and more blood to other people's problems than any other country in the history of the world. And we have brought more peace and more justice around the world than any other country on the globe. So
but that doesn't justify Americans killing unarmed Iraqi civilians, does it?
That's what I'm talking about. And sometimes it hasn't been a great idea. We went into Iraq, we freed them from a dictator, and it was a terrible idea for the United States. But we did it, we sacrificed, and we made it happen.
Robert, clearly there's a disagreement of opinions here whether this pardon was justified, appropriate, but it now stands. There's no way to reverse this, is there?
Well, no, but let me also say why I think this should be important. I mean, we haven't heard the terms Halliburton and Blackwater for a very long time. That hasn't been something that has been on Americans' agenda. It's not been in the vocabulary for quite a while. But that doesn't mean that these contract workers aren't operating across the world on behalf of the U.S. And I think we also saw that on the ground in Portland, for instance, and in Washington, D.C. We've had unnamed military contract workers or whatnot walking around, beating U.S. citizens who are protesting. So it's even on domestic soil in the United States, we're seeing a change in how federal agents are being used and how contract workers are being used to silence American citizens who have a First Amendment right to protest and have a First Amendment right to gather and speak. And so I think that if anything, this pardon becomes a little bit more, a little closer to home for individuals. It should in the United States about who are these contract workers? Are they still being used across the world? Are they being used on American soil? And what does this pardon mean for how they're going to operate, not just in some quote unquote foreign place or some other quote unquote other world, but at home for Americans on their own doorstep?
Yelena, certainly the family members or relatives of the unarmed Iraqi civilians who were killed in 2007 by the Blackwater contractors, certainly it's very disheartening news for them to hear that the perpetrators, the killers of their relatives, have been pardoned. Any international avenue, legal avenue for them out there to make their protests heard?
Yes, well, I mean, the reaction in Iraq has been quite important from the victim society, civil society, even the government officials. It has been very strong and justifiably strong. As I said, the situation can actually amount to violations of international law obligation, and it could engage state responsibility on the international level. That would be before International Court of Justice, should Iraq decide to engage this procedure, because that's the interstate dispute settlement system in the international law. The other possibility is, of course, very highly unlikely that could happen, but it is something that could potentially be envisaged, is the Trump's own responsibility and the individual responsibility as a chief commander of the forces, because he has not complied with the obligation to prosecute, or at least to allow the prosecution of the convicted criminals to go on for war crimes that they committed. So I see only these two avenues as a potential legal avenues that could, in a limited way, take place.
Right.
But we have to see the new transition of powers, presidential powers, how the new administration will actually react to this pardon as well.
And speaking of presidential powers, Kurt, moving beyond this particular case, presidential pardons obviously are a part of U.S. history. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump is certainly by no means the only president who has come under hot water. We remember Bill Clinton was criticized for pardoning fugitive businessman Mark Rich back in the day. Is the presidential pardon, from your point of view, as a lawyer's point of view, what purpose do they serve, really?
Right now, the presidential pardons are an important counterweight to what millions and millions, tens of millions of Americans see as a justice system that is out of balance. A justice system where certain people are given a free pass and other people are not. You cannot have a free country where you have a dual-track justice system. Everyone needs the same justice. Everyone needs due process. Everyone needs to be evaluated the same way. And if it's a crime for one person, it's a crime for another. There's a huge and I think justified perception that there have been miscarriages of justice, both in prosecuting people and not prosecuting people in the United States. The pardon is a powerful tool to address that until we get ourselves back on, back where we need to be. This is an internal problem in the United States. It's a political issue. It's a social issue. And, it's one that we're going to have to address. But one of the ways you address it is by pardoning people, taking them out of the justice system, taking them to a point where they can't be put into a system that, frankly, most people don't see as fair, or many people do not see as completely fair. So hopefully the United States will work out its internal issues on this. Hopefully we will get back to the place where there was a lot of faith in the federal government. Right now there isn't, but the pardons demonstrate that. And I don't, it's a perfectly reasonable response to a perception that people are being persecuted because of their politics.
Robert, before we go, what's your take on presidential pardons in general? They seem to be susceptible to making political decisions, of course, a few days before one leaves office.
Yeah, I mean, if we're interested in dealing with the legal system and fairness in the United States, we should probably be starting at the bottom levels of issues of drug offenses, minor crimes, things that are putting blacks in jail at disproportionate numbers across the country, where it's unfair removing the nuclear family, if that's even a good thing anymore, but removing families from neighborhoods and communities where we apply issues of justice and humanitarian rights, not just in an international context where many Americans might dismiss it, but actually instituting human rights understandings to any justice system within the domestic boundaries of America. And yes, these pardons may dip down into the lower classes and among different racial groups at some point over history, but certainly this is not a way to actually change the wrongs of quote unquote justice system that does treat people very differently. Maybe our guest doesn't have friends who are treated disproportionately, and that's unfortunate. But I have lots of friends, and I know lots of people who have been in the justice system treated unfairly by police, all the way through to prosecutors, judges, corrections institutions, and they're sitting behind bars when their light-skinned counterparts are walking free.
Robert Gucci, Kurt Schlichter, and Yelena Aparaj, thank you so much for joining us and providing some national and international background and insight into presidential pardons, and one pardon in particular. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'm Ali Aslan. Thanks for watching.